In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly King, Advocate, Spirit of truth, who are everywhere present and fill all things, treasury of blessings, bestower of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all that defiles us, and, O good one, save our souls. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I'm pleased to have with me today my classmate from seminary and classmate from English summer school in Ukraine from 1999, Father Alex Wroblicky. Father Alex is originally from California, and his father, he's of Ukrainian ancestry on his father's side, and his father had the distinct honor of being followed by KGB agents during the Cold War when he was doing work for President Reagan.
That's correct.
And so tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, yeah, thanks for the intro. I mean, obviously, yes, from California, grew up out west, and met you in the 90s in Ukraine. Went to seminary with you, been friends for a good long time, and I grew up in a Ukrainian-American household, like a lot of people that are in our parish community, and had those experiences and those stories that my dad used to tell me. He was working for Reagan at the time, to help Reagan get elected in 1980. And as he was he took a weekend off with another Ukrainian who was helping work with Reagan, and they ran into some CIA officers at the gas station, letting them know that they were being tailed by the KGB, most likely because they were Ukrainian, and the Soviets were very concerned that there were two Ukrainians working for Reagan. So that was one of the stories I grew up with.
Well, who would have thought that the time would come when Washington D.C. would be aligning itself with the geopolitical goals of Moscow, and under the guise of conservatism. And so we've come to this point where, as of the past few weeks, many of the things coming out of Washington are not in opposition to Moscow's plans of hegemony, but in support of it. And it's throwing people of conscience who are following the events in Ukraine. It's causing them to raise their voices and say, this isn't what conservatism and a Christian presence in the geopolitical sphere looks like.
Yeah, it's definitely, it seems like white is black and up is down. And it seems like it's been that way since COVID, but it seems like it's keeping on with that.
Yeah.
That trajectory, even now in the Conservative Party, or what used to be a Conservative Party in this country, has completely changed. And anyone who tries to speak differently or speak up in defense of what is branded a neocon or a neoliberal or a warmonger or some other sort of derogatory term.
Yeah, we're living in a world of revolving doors. You know, you had the leftists, their motto for 2 generations at least. Well, maybe 2 generations was my body, my choice. You know, whenever you'd bring up the inviolate dignity of the human being, the right to life of that precious preborn child, their retort was always, you know, my body, my choice. And all of a sudden, when COVID came loose, the pandemic, all of a sudden these same people, when you said to them, hey, whatever happened to my body, my choice, they say, oh no, you have no right to that. You know, roll up your sleeve and get the Fauci ouchie.
Follow the government.
Yeah.
Trust the government.
Trust the government.
Yeah. The same people that from the 60s on was, don't trust the government. Now the government is good.
Right. Yeah. So we have that pivot. You know, all of a sudden, people who were saying for ages, you know, my body, my choice. When it comes to, you know, the vaccinations that were rolled out, all of a sudden that motto that defined them doesn't apply anymore. And then for us, all of a sudden, people who were conservative all of a sudden their party is championed by, a guy who is, I'm thinking of Elon Musk with, 12 kids from 4 different women, and none of them are married. You have, the big tech corporations, Meta, Amazon, all of these are lining up to support this new government. And all of a sudden, this new government is abandoning our allies, which is the exact opposite of what conservative Reagan would have said, is that we're the nation that stands with our allies. And so now that very same motto, stand with your allies, puts us outside of our own movement. We're labeled as warmongers. It's confusing.
Confusing to say the least. It is very confusing, and I think from a values perspective, especially with foreign policy, this country for the most of the 20th century interpreted the aspirational values of the Declaration of Independence. That all men are created equal for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those values were for all men. And it seems like now in America, we're losing that universal value, that universal aspiration, that in decades past, our country would seek to project and to nurture those values wherever they were latent, and whether they were, wherever people were aspiring to be free, we would support that. Now it's, we don't care. We're just going to stay in our hemisphere, and everyone else has to take care of themselves. And so do those values, how do those values in this changing context, how do we promote those values? Or are we going to promote those values? Are they our values anymore?
Well, this dovetails with our discussion on the 3rd anniversary of the invasion by Russia into Ukraine, is values and virtues. And, values and virtues don't change.
No.
They're timeless because they're rooted in God, He who is timeless and eternal. But what the devil does is, because he can never create, he always distorts. He cannot create reality, but he has the power to distort reality and to misdirect it in our perception of it, so that you have Adam and Eve in the garden, and all of a sudden they go from everything being perfect and clear to all of a sudden, maybe we can eat from that tree. Reality hadn't changed. It was their perception of the Word of God that was planted in them that had changed. And that's the same thing that's happened, I think, over these past 3 years. When this happened, it was unanimous across the board. Everyone was outraged that this was happening, that these atrocities were happening. You heard about, in the once Bucha was liberated, about the rapes and the crimes against humanity. Everybody was against this. And then now, 3 years later, nothing has really changed in one sense, in that Russia is still the aggressor, Ukraine is still the victim, that the war is unnecessary, it's unjustifiable. Yet all of a sudden, people's support has changed, and you have a lot of people who are hostile to Ukraine, and a lot of people who are tacitly rooting for Russia, although none of them wear that on their sleeve. But they will do that through attacking support for Ukraine. So there's an article that you have had a chance to read through, and this is the great thing about friendship and about the faith, is that you can disagree with someone you respect and like, and that there's no attack on the person's dignity. It's the ideas, and in this exchange of ideas, we believe that the better idea prevails, and that knowledge increases and that God is glorified. So I'd like to take a look at this article published in Crisis Magazine. Trump looks to correct a disastrous 1990s mistake. And Father Alex, I'll read some sentences here, and then you can share your thoughts here. So this week, this is written in February 14th. All of this really plays into our theme on the third anniversary of the war. Perhaps you're confused. Perhaps you're not sure who to believe. Perhaps you're beginning to question what are the values that are guiding us anymore. Who should I be rooting for here? Should I just be pulling back? Who to believe anymore? It's understandable that people are confused because we're living in an information age in which there's a deluge of news, and it's not always easy to say that's true, that's a lie. There's often a lot of gray. So we hope to do the best that we can as priests and as people familiar with Ukraine to bring some light to the situation. And if you feel we're incorrect on something, please put a comment in the comment section. So this week, President Donald Trump took proactive steps to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia, actions that give me cautious optimism. Of course, his bold initiative has led the warmongers and TDS sufferers to scream, he's a Russian agent.
That's a great, it's a great setup in the article because he's kind of promoting the idea that those who are going to oppose him are either warmongers or TDS, Trump derangement syndrome sufferers, and that is, it's really interesting because that kind of shuts dialogue down almost automatically, because if the side of the right, if you make a claim counter to what he's about to propose, you must be by inference, of course, a warmonger or someone who's suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. I can't talk, but Trump derangement syndrome. And the other thing, he's a Russian he's a Russian agent. We can maybe circle back on that too, but that's also uniquely to this age, kind of going down a different trajectory here, but the political left in this country did so much damage for Ukraine by overusing the idea of Russian misinformation and accusing Trump of something that for many of us just it was inaccurate to accuse him of being an asset with the whole Crossfire hurricane scandal and all of that with the Steele dossier. And so now, if you say, well, that's Russian misinformation, half the country automatically just isn't going to listen to you.
Right. And the left has done no favors to Ukraine by flying, the Ukrainian flag right beside, the transgender flag. And I was in Ukraine 2 years ago, and I was telling people this, and the Ukrainian taxi driver was scratching his head. What?
Yeah.
What? Trans what?
What is that?
You guys do what to your kids? And those people have our flag beside. I'm like, yes. He had no idea. It's like I told him that elephants fly in America and they're all purple and with polka dots on them. And there is no. It's hard to bring the two together, but only in America do you get this. One of the most traditional societies left in Europe is not found in France or Belgium. It's found in Ukraine. Yet here in America, people fly that flag beside the transgender flag. So it's peculiar.
And for people that aren't familiar with Ukraine who might be listening to this podcast, we lived in Ukraine. We were there in Western Ukraine throughout the year. If I were to see you on the street, I would say Slava Isus Christu. Glory to Jesus Christ. Slava Naviki.
Yeah.
And that's glory forever. And at Christmas time, if I see you, I'd say Christos Rождається. Christ is born. And you would say,
glorify him.
Glorify him, right? So that's how I remember being in Ukraine in 1999. I would say that to the taxi cab drivers that I got into the taxi with. That's
Yeah.
how I said hi to him. I remember
Yeah.
saying that. It's like, yeah, you know.
And in the spring, around Easter time, you greet people, Christos voskres, Christ is risen. And here,
Yeah.
they want me to believe that Ukraine is the nation that is against
Yeah.
traditional values.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go to Russia, anywhere in Russia today, and you say to people, in a taxi, Slava Jezus Christu, glory to Jesus Christ.
They look at you like you're crazy.
Yeah, they're going to look at you like some kind of alien is climbing out of your chest.
Just to share something personally, about this, going back to my background and, as you introduced earlier, growing up in California, I mean, my parents, my family, we would say, glory to Jesus Christ, Christ is born, Christ is risen. We would do those greetings. But it was only in the little church community in California, and there was 100 of us. That was it. And when I went to Ukraine as a young man after college, a big part of my conversion and why I'm a priest today is it was so cool to go into a city of almost 1 million people, and I could go into a taxi cab, I could go into a cafe. Christos rождається. Everyone would know the answer.
Yeah.
It was so cool. It was like, wow, I'm finally with my own people here.
Yeah.
Wow, this is awesome. And it was everywhere. It was so awesome. The faith was so alive.
Yep.
And it is still alive there. It's amazing how vibrant the faith
Churches
is.
are full in Ukraine. They're not full in Russia. I had a priest tell me that 2-3 years ago, the Russian Orthodox Church decided to do some statistics and to count how many people were in their churches in Moscow on Easter Sunday. So this is the high holy day of all holy days. And if anyone's going to go to church in Moscow, it's going to be on Easter Sunday. And they did the tally. Guess what percentage of the Moscow population didn't have to stay for the whole service. It was just coming through the door. They could have come through the door, make the sign of the cross, and then turned around and went back out. That would have counted. Guess what percentage?
I'm going to say between 0.5% and 2%.
It was 0.5%. It was 0.5% of the whole population of Moscow. And Moscow is the heart, the mind, the soul of Russia. Everything revolves in Russia around Moscow.
Yeah.
So you had 99.5% of your people not even going into a church, a Russian Orthodox church,
on Easter.
But
you do that same poll in Lviv today, and all of the churches are packed throughout the time.
Packed. So
Easter baskets and all that. But
so when people start talking about that Russia is the Holy Russia, the flag bearer of Christianity, the restorer of traditional values, let's look at their track record. And is that happening in Russia today? And let's look at Ukraine. Is that happening in Ukraine today? And you can say, yes, it's happening in Ukraine today. People are populating their churches. I was at a seminary there a year and a half ago. 200 seminarians in one seminary. So let's get on with this, though. Essentially, Trump is arguing that Russia is more beneficial as an ally than an adversary, and that America's historic decision to promise NATO membership to Ukraine was a significant strategic error. Both these things should be simple common sense. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I would say that, again, it's inaccurate because America never made a promise for Ukraine to join NATO.
Never.
There was a statement, I think, in 2008. I think he's referencing George W. Bush's statement in 2008 that Ukraine should become a member of NATO. That the U.S.'s position is to support their entry into NATO. However, that's not how NATO works. NATO is a defensive organization, and you have to apply to get into NATO. NATO doesn't promise membership to anyone. You apply, and then you are received into the alliance when you meet certain frameworks. So that's not how NATO works. So this is just not accurate. It's also, and again, this is the challenge, right? This is a Russian talking point. You can see it in any propaganda or any statement that Lavrov or any member of the Russian State Department will make, and yet this gentleman is advocating that position as if it's true, when there is a nuance. And I think, just to mention too, you were talking about, the illusion of Adam and Eve in the garden, and the perception of reality is distorted. Well, as we've often talked before, heresy, there's always an element of truth in heresy. There's always an element of truth in propaganda that's a lie. So this is getting twisted here. This was not a strategic error that led to the conflict in Ukraine, which he's going to go on to say later in the article.
Yeah.
So,
and also what's again, Eric, if you're watching, I mean, I respect you greatly and everything that Crisis Magazine represents, but these are just matters of fact, and I think it's important that we speak to reality and fact.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do know that in 2000, NATO membership discussions, the preliminary discussions about NATO membership was offered to Russia.
yes,
And
it was.
And obviously Russia felt a little, I think, insulted that they had to get in line behind Hungary and other Eastern Bloc nations, and they categorically said no, unless we're given seats at the front, we're not playing that game. But they were offered. So if this was a way to freeze out Moscow, then why would they extend the invite?
Well, yeah, and that's the next paragraph. We're going to get to a lot of this stuff, but you're essentially correct. We offered NATO membership to Russia, and they didn't want it for those reasons. And I think that was the goal, after the fall of the Soviet Union, to bring them into the alliance for collective security, which is what it's intended to be. But I also don't think, did you mention the name of the author when we started? I know. It's
Eric.
Eric Sammons. Eric Sammons from Crisis Magazine. So.
Yep. So the geopolitical landscape post-Cold War presented the United States with a unique chance to redefine its relationship with Russia. But instead of fostering an alliance that could bring about long-term peace, the neocons in both the Bush and Clinton administrations, H.W. Bush, supported by the military-industrial complex, wanted to keep the NATO bureaucracy alive. So they treated the 1990s Russia as a weakened enemy to be exploited. It was like kicking a dog that's already seriously injured. Once the dog heals, however, it's going to remember who kicked it.
Yeah, this is probably I think this is perhaps the most inaccurate paragraph in the whole article.
Okay. Why so?
Well, the idea that we wanted to kick Russia when it was down in the 1990s just is contrary to all facts. In fact, I have the information here to share with people. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States provided significant diplomatic, economic, and humanitarian support to Russia to aid in its transition from a communist system to a market-based democracy. And this included economic assistance. The U.S. provided billions of dollars, right, in financial aid through programs like Freedom Support Act of 1992, which allocated funds for economic reforms, private sector development, and humanitarian relief. Then they provided technical and policy guidance. American advisors worked with Russian officials to implement market-oriented economic reforms, including privatization, banking, and legal frameworks. 3, nuclear security and non-proliferation. Through the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, the U.S. helped dismantle and secure nuclear weapons left over from the Soviet era, reducing the risk of nuclear proliferation. And that cost billions of dollars too. Humanitarian aid. The U.S. provided food, medical supplies, and other humanitarian assistance during the economic hardships in the 1990s when the Soviet Union wasn't growing food, didn't have medicine, and that was also billions of dollars in aid. Finally, 2 more things. Trade and investment. The U.S. encouraged investment in Russia and supported its integration into the global economic institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So Russia wasn't in the IMF and wasn't in the World Bank. We helped get them there, to help them, the economic benefits of that are astounding, and yet we promoted that. We helped them get there so that they could be an equal partner in the world.
And people often overlook. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
And then democracy and governance programs, American organizations and government agencies supported Russian civil society, supported independent media, which Putin has systematically destroyed. There's no free media in Russia anymore, and political institutions to promote democratic governance. So all of this is what we did. In one aspect, after the fall of the Soviet Union, despite this assistance, Russia's transition faced significant challenges, including turmoil, political instability, and corruption, which eventually would strain U.S.-Russia relations. So this is not telling the whole story. And then just to add a couple more things, people don't realize George Bush, with his, we call it the Chicken Kiev speech. He went to Ukraine and spoke before the Ukrainian parliament and encouraged them not to become independent. Stay with the Soviets. Stay with the Russians.
Yeah.
The
CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States.
Correct.
I remember that.
I mean, we were on Russia's side.
Yeah.
We were supporting Russia.
And I remember speaking with someone who was in the military a number of years ago, an American, and he was sharing his experiences with the military exchanges and the nuclear non-proliferation agreements in the mid-90s. They would do these exchanges, and the Americans received the Russians first. Mm-hmm. And they this was in the kind of the euphoria of the post-Cold War era.
Yep.
I remember that.
Yeah, it was a whole new
It was, they're our friends now,
Yeah.
And we, as a Canadian, I love the fact that all these
hockey players
are coming in. It raised the quality of hockey. And Sergei Fedorov and Makarov for the Calgary Flames.
Yeah.
It just raised the quality of play in the NHL, and we loved having the Russians. It was great. And so this former service member was telling me that they opened up their facilities, all kinds of nuclear facilities that were off limits to U.S. citizens, to say nothing of members of the Soviet Union. But now they're bringing in these generals from who were KGB generals into the most sensitive parts, and they're showing them, here's this, here's that, and these guys are taking it all in. Mm-hmm. Well, when it came time to reciprocate, and for the Americans to go over to Russia
to see the same,
to inspect this and to see the same, it was locked down like Fort Knox. You can't go in here, you can't go over there, you can't breathe here, you can't look there, don't ask questions, don't see this. Oh, this appointment is canceled, that appointment is moved. So and so supposed to be here, they're sick, they can't be here now. There's the airplane, you better go. So this was something that was repeated.
Yeah.
And the suspicion didn't start, from the perspective of this service member, didn't start with the Americans. The suspicion was initiated on the Russian side. And that people need to know that. People need to know that. And that's just one anecdote, but it's an anecdote that tells a lot about the reciprocity in a very important organ in Russian society, the military. It was not open and reciprocal. Mm-hmm. It was still operating with this suspicion towards the West.
Yeah, and a lot of that too, as the leadership in Russia didn't change with the fall of the Soviet Union. The same KGB, the same communist leaders just changed their names, changed their titles, and became democratic. Yeah. And became capitalists. They became businessmen, and that corruption and that dysfunctional closed society remained in Russia.
Right. Yeah. And it's reflected just in travel. All after 91, all kinds of Russians were coming into the United States. Hey, you want to come here, have a free life? Go through the process, but come on over. And so you go to Miami, you go to Brighton Beach in New York. I mean, you go to so many places throughout the country, and you hear Russian all over the place. There's no suspicion of them. Come and have a crack at this great thing called American life. But try doing that in Russia. I mean, it's very difficult for someone just to get through the border. I mean, you need to have, to this day, you still need to have an official invite from someone within Russia, entry visa, exit visa, all of this stuff. So that openness and reciprocity to this day, up to 2022, it wasn't in place.
Yeah,
and
I think that's the thing. The idea that we were kicking a dog that was injured, we were kicking a dog that was already beaten down, and further adding insult to injury. That is historical revisionism.
Yeah.
There's just the data just doesn't add up there. We made a good faith effort, as you said, to bring Russia into NATO to help with the reforms. We poured billions of dollars, and maybe we'll get this to a point later in the article, but I think that the concern now again is Ukraine is actually winning the war, and I think the West is afraid of another collapse of the Russian Federation.
Yes,
that's what's driving this push to peace, not the altruism of we just want the war to stop.
Right.
I mean,
Washington's afraid of having to deal with 15 republics, newly created, should Russia dissolve.
Yeah, and I've seen some data. They would project that there could be, if the Russian Civil War was to break out now, it could be between 15 to 20 million deaths, massive starvation, massive economic turmoil, and the possible use of nuclear weapons. Internally within Russia.
Yeah,
that's a horrible thing. That's probably what's driving this more than anything else.
Yeah,
is that.
Yeah, and notice that the Americans have managed this war and throttling the supplies such that Russia doesn't suffer defeat, but that Ukraine doesn't win.
Yeah, and that's very telling, I think.
Let's go to the next line here.
Yeah.
So why did the U.S. continue to treat Russia like an enemy after the fall of the Soviet Union? Every defense I've seen for this catastrophic policy usually boils down to soft racism against the Russian people. You can't trust them. They'll always be aggressive. It's in the Russian blood to try to take over the world, etc. But our bellicose policy is self-fulfilling. By marching up to their borders, we make Russia more likely to be aggressive toward the outside world. Then the neocons can just say, see, we told you so.
Yeah. This whole NATO argument of the war in Ukraine, this actually said the war of Russian aggression against Ukraine, is such a red herring argument because Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia have been a part of NATO since 2000 and
Sure.
They've been there for many years now, and they are geographically much closer to St. Petersburg or Moscow than Ukraine is. And there has been no war. There has been no invasion. Finland now is a NATO country. Sweden too, but Finland has 1,000 mile or 1,000 kilometer border with Russia, and again, it's closer to St. Petersburg and Moscow than Ukraine is. Mm-hmm. I mean, Finland is right there, and St. Petersburg is the cultural heart and cultural capital of Russia. The idea that us pushing up to their borders is what's causing this. Well, if that were the case, they would have struck decades ago. Mm-hmm. There's something more going on with Ukraine.
Yeah, there's a number of things happening. I'd like to speak a little bit about rare earth minerals, about population, but a little bit about history. And if it's NATO that is the catalyst for Russian action here, mm-hmm. then what are we to make of Russia moving into these lands before NATO even existed? So if you go before the Second World War, why is it that this same phenomenon, what was happening then? So Russia expanding into Georgia and expanding into Armenia, expanding into Ukraine, expanding into the Baltics, expanding into Moldova, expanding into Poland. Pre-Soviet Union, the border of Russia went right into Warsaw. Mm-hmm. And people often aren't aware of that. I had someone here a couple years ago wanting me to translate his grandfather's birth certificate, and he was baffled because his grandfather was a devout Polish Roman Catholic, but all the documents all written in Russian. I said, well, that's because Russia took over Poland, and it was right into Warsaw, and the official documentation was in the language of the land. Controlled by Russia. So NATO didn't exist then. So what provoked Russia to want to do this? And it gets back to the question of this national psychological fear, because they have no natural border. There is no natural border like the mountains or an ocean separating Moscow from Berlin. It's just endless forest and plain.
So they seek to push their borders to the Carpathian Mountains or beyond, and have the land in between as a sort of demilitarized zone, as like a buffer zone, to hopefully keep the invaders away.
Right. So you have from like Kiev was controlled by Poland for centuries, and you have on the other western extreme, you have Warsaw, which for a while was controlled by Moscow. So everything in between there is kind of like is viewed as like elastic territory. That's Russia's high water point is Warsaw, and Kiev is viewed as Poland's historic high water point. The time of Saint Hyacinth was there when the Mongols invaded Kiev, and that was in the 13th century. So that's one thing. The other thing is that Russia's movement into the area has everything to do, as Mark Stein said in 2006, with that it has to do with the population dearth. Russia has a demographic problem, and it cannot extract itself from that problem. It has been aborting babies since the Russian Revolution. And it's a way of contraception. You cannot do that indefinitely and get off with it. Nature doesn't forgive. You have a math problem, Russia, and the only way to recoup those populations is by force.
Conquering other people. And subjugating people.
And it just so happens that the areas, remember during Bush's war in the Middle East, is that it was an oil war, and there was truth to that, I think. This is a rare earth minerals war. It's no coincidence that the areas that Putin has gone into in the Donbass and all the way over near Mykolaiv, they're rich, and up to Zaporizhia. So it's very much a rare earth minerals war. It's very much an abortion war of trying to undo the effects of their own licentiousness. Let's get to the next paragraph here. At that time, the U.S. should have begun the process of dismantling NATO, whose very reason for existence had disappeared, but instead it went in the opposite direction, beginning the push to expand NATO right to Russia's borders. This policy continued in the 21st century, and George W. Bush even indicated that Ukraine would eventually be included, a decision that everyone in Russia, from the most hardline to the most liberal, viewed as a direct security threat.
I mean, just what you were talking about with the ebb and flow of the borders, right? That's a great segue into this paragraph. And again, NATO doesn't push to expand itself. People apply to join NATO. It's a defensive alliance, and those countries that have been invaded by Russia historically over centuries, those countries have wanted to join NATO for security defense, security guarantees.
And nobody ever asked that question.
Against Russia.
Yeah, why is it that these cluster of nations around Russia want to join a defensive military alliance? Isn't that peculiar?
Why? Do tell, pray tell. Why? Exactly. It's so... This thing, if people from Western parts of Europe and North Americans want to know what Russia is really like, ask their neighbors. Ask a Lithuanian, ask an Estonian, ask a Latvian, ask a Belarusian, ask a Ukrainian, ask a Georgian what they think.
Yeah, this is something that many people are unaware of. They think that we people who are supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, its religious freedom, are racist against Russians. That we have condescending views towards Russians. That we think that they're all murderers and rapists and all this stuff. But if you were to pause for a moment and look at largely Russian views towards their ethnic minorities that surround their border, or even the ethnic minorities within Russia, there is rampant racism there. The way that they treat the Lithuanians, the way they treat the Poles, the way they treat the Ukrainians, to say nothing of the racial minorities within the Russian Federation. It's no coincidence that a disproportionate number of the men in the most difficult
fighting
theaters of war are from Baturia. They're the Baturins from north of Mongolia. They're the ethnic minorities who are doing the heavy lifting,
the fighting in Ukraine,
dying in disproportionately high numbers. They're not the sons and the sons of the elite from St. Petersburg and Moscow.
Nope.
Their sons live abroad.
Yeah.
To this day, many of the elites in the Moscow-St. Petersburg axis
live abroad.
They live abroad. Yeah. Their sons are not in the war.
Yeah.
But it is the racial minorities that are sent into the meat grinder. It's Russia that sends its forces in to these neighboring regimes. Look how they treated the people in Dagestan. Yeah. Because there is a prevalent racist narrative in Russia, and that they are the kind of the Ubermensch of the Slavs, and it's very unbrotherly.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, this is just this paragraph just isn't. There's nothing there that's accurate about how that happened in history.
Let's go down to, we'll skip a few paragraphs here. This decision to expand NATO to Ukraine was not just a strategic blunder, it was the prime catalyst for the tensions we see today. For all the fever talk of Putin wanting to recreate the Soviet Empire, the reality is that we are the ones who greatly expanded our sphere of influence, not them. The end of the Cold War could have marked the beginning of a new era where Russia and the US worked in tandem on international challenges. Instead, it escalated into a new rivalry.
Yeah, and again, I would say that America made a good faith effort at the fall of the Soviet Union. We were there, we remember, to bring Russia into the family of nations, into the free family of nations. And Russia backpedaled into the authoritarianism because authoritarianism is what Russia has always known. And the idea of seeing that our decision to expand NATO to Ukraine is the prime catalyst of the tensions we see today. That's not true. I mean, you've talked about the population crisis. You've talked about
rare
earth minerals. But one thing we haven't talked about is the existential historical understanding of Russians and how they view Ukrainians as Russian traitors, as little Russians, as Ukraine being theirs. And this war, if you go to Russia Media Matters, if you listen to that, to what the rhetoric is in Russia often, it's not so much about NATO as it is about Ukraine being traitors, Ukraine being their historical lands, Ukraine's history being their history. Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities. This is an existential conflict for Russia because Russia's identity is borrowed from Ukraine. And the Ukraine cannot exist in Russia's mind because for Ukraine to exist as a free state, it would existentially challenge their suppositions of who they are as a people. Mm-hmm. So Ukraine has to be Russian. And there will not be any peace as long as Ukraine is free because Russia never accepted Ukrainian independence in 1991. They don't accept independence now and they never will in the future. So, Mr. Sammons, with all due respect, your understanding of the history of this region is very limited. And to say that we're to blame for this ignores all of the history of oppression, of colonial oppression of Ukraine by the Muscovites, the Russians, going back to the 17th century.
Yeah. And even if let's take the argument at face value for a moment that that NATO caused this by expanding and going into Russia's soft underbelly, is that, well, if that's the price that Russia had to pay for the 100 million deaths that it's ultimately responsible for in the 20th century, according to the Black Book of Communism, then so be it. That's just the rule of playing the game. If you lose, you suffer the consequences. They lost the Cold War after all the evil that they laid upon the face of the earth. The Soviets lost it. Russia never had to endure a Nuremberg trial for all the evils that Moscow unleashed on the world. The mass murders, the reign of terror, the rapes, the re-education camps, the taking kids away from their parents, the destruction of whole nations, the
genocide in Ukraine,
unbelievable things that happened. I haven't even spoken about Siberia. All of this. Not once did Russia face an accounting of that. Not once. So if, like Germany did, and Germany's reign of terror, its hellscape, if you will, was basically from the war started in 38 until 45, 7 years.
7 years.
Now the Soviet Union, it was 75 years. Okay, 75 years, the Soviet Union.
Then add the Russian Empire from Peter the Great.
Well, then I guess it's really
to the Soviet times. That's a few centuries.
So they never had to account for this. So if this is the price that they had to pay, that in a world that respects sovereign nations, free choices, that their neighboring former subjected nation states like Belarus or Ukraine or Latvia would choose to take a different path, then that doesn't seem to me to be such a bad choice. I mean, we've done that with Cuba. Cuba has chosen a completely different course out of our sphere of influence, and the U.S. has abided by that. We didn't let them put nuclear missiles there, but Ukraine isn't asking to have nuclear missiles put in its backyard. They gave it up to Russia. If we've respected Cuba turning away from our interests and aligning themselves with dictatorships, hey, why can't Russia reciprocate? That is the price of playing the game and losing. Russia lost the Cold War, and that's the price they're going to have to pay.
Yeah, and the thing is again, Russia's never going to allow Ukraine to be free. They have to control Ukraine, because Ukraine is the repository of their historical legacy.
It is, and their metallurgic industrial base was all in Donbass. Their navy was in Crimea. Even as members of the clergy, you and I are aware that the Russian Orthodox Church up until the late 90s, early 2000s was populated by Ukrainian priests. Approximately for every 2 Orthodox priests in the Russian Orthodox Church, 1 was from Ukraine.
And you remember, did you see that video recently on social media? There was a synod or some sort of meeting of clergy in the Russian Orthodox Church just recently. And one of the priests spoke up to the bishop saying, this convergence of politics and faith that we have going on in our church, and with the war and all that's not healthy. This isn't what we're supposed to be as Christians. And do you know what the bishop asked him?
No.
The bishop goes, who are you, this priest? Where are you from? You must be from Western Ukraine with those ideas. Literally, insulting this priest. And this priest is a very brave man who knows what happened to him or his family as a result of him saying this. But the response of the bishop is this: you must be a Western Ukrainian because you're talking faith in the church.
Yeah.
I mean, that should tell you everything you need to know. I mean, this is just, I think, hopefully this is resonating with the people listening to it, because this article is
so here it goes on. Wouldn't it be better to have Russia as an ally rather than an enemy?
Yeah.
If you haven't been influenced by decades of neocon anti-Russian propaganda, the answer to this question is obvious. Well, you could very well pose that question regarding Osama bin Laden. What Putin has been doing to the Ukrainian population for 3 years now is a constant, unmitigated 9/11 every day.
Yeah.
Drones, missiles into residential buildings. It's calculated terror.
Yep.
It's terrorism.
Amen.
And for people to say that, we can just bring them in and have them part of the team, when you have daily terrorism on this level, we're dealing with evil, and you don't want to bring someone like that in. You want them to. Now it's different if they repent and they voluntarily say what I've done is wrong. By all means, yes, come on in. But at this point, there needs to be a recognition that this is not less than Osama bin Laden, and I don't think any American, 24 years ago would say, let's not keep Osama bin Laden in the cold. We have to.
What happened as an enemy? Let's bring him in as an ally.
Yeah. No.
Well, just to underscore that point, this last week in Ukraine, there have been 1,100 drone attacks, 1,300 guided bomb attacks, and 35 missile attacks. And Ukraine as a territory, to give the readers a visual image, or the listeners a visual image, the borders of Ukraine roughly are from Chicago, Illinois, to New York, to Erie, to Charlotte. Erie, Pennsylvania, to Charlotte, North Carolina. Imagine in that space of the United States, 1,100 drones, 1,300 guided bombs, and 35 missiles being shot in that territory. That's what Russia does to Ukraine on a weekly basis. And
was this during the time of the peace talks?
This is this last week. So as of this last week, that's how many they reported. So that happens on a weekly basis. And
so let's bring them into the fold.
Let's bring them into the fold. They're allies.
No consequences.
There's no consequences for their aggression, And then also just this sentence is a real beauty, It sounds great, right? But Mr. Salmons, I have to say, with all due respect, the USA has been a strategic enemy of Russia in every defense statement for the last 10 years. You may want Russia to be an ally. I think even in some perfect idealistic world, I would want to agree with you. However, Russia doesn't want to be your ally. Russia declares us as an enemy. Period.
Yeah. And I recently spoke with a former American ambassador who revealed that in 2023 or 2024, I think it was 2023, that the Kremlin line item for foreign directed propaganda was $1 billion. Mm-hmm. If you are Russia and if you're in an existential battle, would you spend money to influence the public opinion of Americans? You bet you would, especially when those people are electing the leaders who decide to send money and military aid to your enemy. So of course Russia wants to influence American public opinion. It wants to change the narrative so that Ukraine is not the victim but the aggressor, and that Russia is the victim here. And it's interesting how that has become the conversation.
That's the conversation, yeah.
And even President Trump has had the G7 and the UN try to back down from using the term aggressor in relation to Russia. It's the new unreality. This is to history what transgenderism is to biology. It is the absolute inversion of proper order. So this is what we're facing.
And ironically, conservatives are now playing the leftist game of renaming reality, using language as a weapon.
Yeah.
You know, the person who controls the meaning of words controls the conversation. And so now, you know, Zelensky is a dictator, even though he was popularly elected with, I think, 73% of the vote.
Yeah, and the U.S. and the Ukrainian Constitution forbids elections during martial law. And the guy who actually is a dictator, who has a long list of journalists, businessmen, and politicians who've conveniently fallen out of windows, and he's been in office since 2000 with a brief little interlude with Medvedev, who conveniently just is more of a puppet president. But he's been the dictator for 25 years. You know, we can't call him the dictator.
No.
You know, he's
the president.
Yeah. And no elections there. No elections there. No. But you need to have elections in Ukraine.
He's won for 20 years. He's the greatest singular democratic politician.
Yeah, and I hear in some of the regions, like their vote tally is like 99% every time.
I heard it's 102.
102%
vote goes to Putin.
But that's, so okay.
Yeah.
So Trump's recent diplomatic efforts, therefore, are an attempt to mend this historic rift. His push for negotiations between Ukraine and Russia is a recognition that peace benefits all parties involved, reducing the human and economic toll of conflict. Diplomacy in this case serves not only the interests of the involved nations, but also global stability. By advocating for peace and a new relationship with Russia, Trump is attempting to rectify the mistakes of past U.S. policy. We need to stop asking Ukrainians to die for these mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is just such, it's just silly because Russia invaded Ukraine. This is a war of aggression against Ukraine. And it really does upset me. I see it a lot in the media. It's the Ukraine war. Well, it's not as if the war started in Ukraine, if it's something that's germane to Ukraine. This war never would have started. There would have been no violence in 2014, no separatism if it wasn't provoked by Russia. Russia has been aggressing and being aggressive to Ukraine since 2014 with physical violence. And Ukrainians aren't paying for our mistakes. Ukrainians are dying because Russia is being aggressive and is invading their country. And all that needs to happen for there to be peace is for Russia to go home. That's it. And there will be peace. Immediately.
If Russia stops fighting, there's peace.
Yeah.
If Ukraine stops fighting, it ceases to exist.
Correct. It's 100%.
Yeah.
Truer words were never spoken. It's a very simple truism.
Yeah.
And people need to remember that.
Yeah. I find it frustrating when people pretend, or maybe not pretending, but they put on airs of caring more about Ukrainians than Ukrainians care about Ukrainians.
Yeah.
These are people who've lived through the Holodomor, in which who knows how many, at least 4 million people died in 32 and 33. These are the people who endured the famine in the early 1922 or 1925. These are the people who endured the reign of terror under the NKVD. These are the people who endured World War II. People forget that the majority of the blood shed wasn't on Normandy's beaches. It was in Belarus and Ukraine and Poland. That whole corridor there, that's where the vast majority of the blood was spilled, disproportionately on Ukraine's soil. People forget that, that it was actually Ukrainians and other ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union who died.
Fighting,
And Russia claims all of these as Russians. But they weren't. They were people from all these different republics. People forget that the population in eastern Ukraine was systematically Russified. That these people were deprived of their faith, of their land, of their cultural identity. They were killed. They were assimilated. They were moved out to Siberia, And they've lived through this. This has been their history. So when these same people who've done this to their fathers and their forefathers over the course of generations, not just in the Soviet times, but during the Tsarist times, that when they come in again, all of a sudden, people say, well, just give up, there'll be peace.
Yeah.
They have a genetic history here that involves being subjected to this same kind of cruelty. And at a certain point, they have to say, we just cannot tolerate that kind of evil to our children. Our women being raped, our kids being brainwashed and taken from us, our churches being closed. But it's very easy for the comfortable journalists in the safety of America to say, peace, peace. It's not a just peace.
Well, exactly. And Patriarch Sviatoslav, the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, our spiritual leader in our church, he had a statement with the bishops that said recently, Ukraine is tired, we're exhausted, we don't want the war to continue, but we're not going to give up. We're still motivated to fight because we want freedom. We don't want this anymore. And this idea when these pundits in the media here say, we want the lives of Ukrainians to stop dying and being sacrificed for what? Well, they're making that sacrifice like Americans make the sacrifice for our freedoms.
Yeah.
And you would think MAGA would love that. That would be something that MAGA would champion. People fighting for their country, for their freedom, opposing tyranny and government control, Yeah. You'd think that they would love that. But
You'd think. The next paragraph here is rape blaming. Critics of Trump's approach will argue that it rewards Russian aggression. However, this perspective ignores our past provocations, and it overlooks the reality of international relations where peace requires concessions from all sides. Peace talks de-escalate tensions, potentially leading to a more stable Eastern Europe. The promise of NATO expansion into Ukraine was a direct challenge to Russian security interests. And while that does not justify Russia's actions, it's vital to understand the provocations that led to the current standoff. This, to me, I don't know if I'm alone in this, but it sounds like this is blaming the rape victim. Because you've provoked these guys by wearing a short dress. You're to blame for this.
But it doesn't justify their actions at the same time. So we got to throw that in there.
Right. So it's blaming the rape victim. And why is Russia's security interests prioritized over that of other equally sovereign nations? This is just, it's one-sided, I think, Eric. I have to say that. What about Ukraine's security interests? What about Georgia's security interests? What about Moldova's security interests? What about Lithuania's security interests? Do they not count? Are they taking a back seat to Russia's security interests? And why is it, after all that Russia has done to attack faith, family, freedom, and farm, why is it that Russia's security interests are prioritized? That's something that needs to be answered. I think it betrays a certain prejudice.
It does, and Eric, the truth is you've answered your own question. Even if we were to grant you, which we don't, I think we've substantially shown how I think your main position about NATO was wrong in this article. But even if we were to grant you that NATO expansion was the cause of this conflict, you yourself have said it does not justify Russia's actions. Russia's actions were not justified in this.
No, they're not. They're not. And it is really a statement to our friends that their alliance with us is their most fatal and flawed decision.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to be a friend of America, and that's going to provoke the larger dictatorial regional powers, like, let's say, I don't know, China, if you're living in Asia, East Asia, then this is saying the most dangerous thing you've ever done is you've chosen to be friends with America.
Yeah.
Because when the big dragon comes after you to get retribution, we're going to back away and we're going to start self-blaming. We provoked this. Mm-hmm. But this is the kind of the burden of noble and free nations, is that they not only hold up the specter of freedom and liberty, religious freedom foremost among it, to nations, but they also have the responsibility of protecting those who have joined into this relationship of free nations. What kind of freedom, what kind of liberty is it that promotes it, but is afraid to defend one's very friends? This is the clear message I think that China is receiving, is that we're not going to stand up for our friends. And the other thing they forget that is not mentioned here is that we are responsible because Ukraine gave up the equivalent of $1.7 trillion worth of nuclear weapons,
bombers, a fleet of strategic bomber fleets,
and ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads, the third largest stockpile on planet Earth. It's been valued at least $1.5 to $1.7 trillion. And Ukraine hands it over, and then the country to which they handed these over to now attacks them, and people here are saying, well, what obligation do we have here? We provoked this.
Yeah.
No, it's Russia that has the nuclear weapons here, not Ukraine.
And we start asking for rare earth minerals and payment for all the money we gave them, but what about the value of all of the nuclear arsenal that Ukraine gave up? And I don't think there's anyone listening to this this video, or anyone reading, or anyone following this issue that would argue that Russia would still have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine still had that nuclear arsenal.
Right. Yeah. So we'll finish here with just a few more paragraphs. Moreover, Trump's strategy reflects a pragmatic approach to foreign policy, where the end goal is not victory over an opponent, but stability and cooperation. Too many people today take a comic book view of international relations, where there are only good guys and bad guys, and the good guys, us, have to completely and utterly defeat the bad guys, them. The real world isn't like that. This isn't about capitulation, but about finding a middle ground where both nations can coexist without the threat of further conflict. Before I ask you something, I want to say this because I'll forget, is the biblical injunction is contrary to this. When you look at what God required of the Israelites when they came into Canaan, it was to cleanse the land. It was to cleanse the land of anything having to do with paganism and Canaanite religion. Yeah. And you can read the scriptures very clearly as to how they were to clean the land, and it's pretty brutal. But you look at it from the eyes of faith, and you understand what the Lord is after here. He's after purity. He does not want evil in the world, and those who are aligned with it, they need to be held to account for this evil. Hopefully, as St. Paul says, through the punishment of their bodies, they'll save their souls. And that's what we want, is we want Russia to be saved as a nation. We want her people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. But there has to be a reckoning. There has to be a reparation. There has to be a recognition that what they are doing is wrong. And they've had 25 years of consistent propaganda. There is no free press in Russia. And their people actually believe the lies that Putin tells them. We know, for example, during the Second World War, if I could take an example from Nazi Germany, that when the Americans came in, by 1950, many in the German populace still believed in the Nazi ideology because it was so ingrained in them through years of propaganda. Now, from the beginning of when Hitler took power, was it 1932? I'm not sure, 31, 32. So there was 6 or 7 years of a lead up to the war of a constant drumbeat of Nazi ideology in the press in Germany. 7 years. Putin has had 25 years of this. 25 years. So this propaganda is deep in the Russian mind, and it's not going to come out easily. And there has to be a real reckoning.
And there's a lot more to it than just Putin too, because it's Alexander Dugin and his writings about the Russian world, which really
it's a
pagan thing, but it ties into that Russian messianism of centuries past, where the Holy Russia would save everyone.
Yeah, Pan-Slavism,
all of that.
Moscow at the center of it.
And we can't forget that all of this comes out of a whole context of Russian historical understanding of self, that they are the heirs of Kiev and Rus, which, all of that feeds into Russians' ambivalence and hatred for everything Ukrainian. This is an interesting conclusion.
So I do disagree that this is a case of good guys and bad guys.
Yeah.
When you kidnap, Eric, 19,500 kids from their families, and you brainwash them, put them into re-education camps, and farm them out to Russian families, that's evil. And if it were your children, Eric, who were abducted by Vladimir Putin, and 3 years into this, you had no idea if your children were still alive or where they were, I don't think you'd be writing this. For every parent who's had their child abducted by Vladimir Putin, we can say without any equivocation that this is what bad guys do.
Yeah.
You look at the daycares in Ukraine that have had missile attacks, daycares. There's no strategic military purpose to do that other than terror. It's a weapon of terror to terrorize an entire nation, to hit their energy sector during war, during winter, to send missiles, not drones, missiles into residential buildings, hospitals, to send military drones into Chernobyl. All of these things are things that evil people do. And what Ukraine is doing is defending their women, their children, and their elderly from these attacks. That's something called good. This is a case of good versus bad.
Yeah, I agree. And it's a good point. And let's just leave it at that. I mean, there's some other things about this paragraph that are kind of interesting. But
let's go to the next paragraph here. The Washington warmongers, of course, are not happy. They argue for a complete defeat of Russia, not because they think this is actually possible, but because they know that it will make war unending and keep the funds flowing to their allies in the military-industrial complex. Their words might sound noble, but ultimately for them, it's about the bottom line. War has always been good for business.
I mean, to a certain extent, I'm not going to disagree with them there. People do profit off of war. The military-industrial complex profits off of selling weapons. That's true. However, this is kind of like it's a Whopper, right? Like it's nothing. It's a nothing burger, right? Like that's been the case since time immemorial. People have profited off of war. That's not the reason that this conflict exists. It might be partly the reason why we've prolonged it. I think that we should have given aid quicker and in more immediate fashion. We should have given Ukrainians the things that they needed immediately to end the war quicker. That's definitely true. But for him to make the claim that this is what the sole reason for the conflict is for this, is in a sense he's doing exactly what he's saying in the previous paragraph of doing with accusing other people of doing. He's oversimplifying this as this kind of good versus evil kind of thing, but just blaming us. He's just inverting the order and calling us the warmongers. We're the bad ones, and these are the good guys, and he's guilty of the very thing that he criticizes in the previous paragraph.
There can be no peace that ignores justice. Peace for peace's sake, without obviously the peace that is rooted in Christ, is no peace. Peace is not just the absence of war. Peace is friendship with God. But there can be no true peace if Russia is killing its brethren, if Russia is invading its neighbor's land, raping its women. There can be no peace unless there is a real repentance individually on the part of those responsible for initiating this war, and collectively as a nation. And we saw that with Germany, that they underwent that. So for there to be true peace, it's not something that is a negotiated settlement by a larger external power, in this case the United States. It is far more than that. It is a religious experience in which both sides come to see God as their common Father, and that those who are responsible for the evils not only reconcile, but make restitution to those whom they've injured.
Yeah, I mean
and failing that, this will resume as soon as that stronger external power
is gone.
Yeah. It's just going to resume.
If it's just the cessation of violence, it's doomed to resume again. The biblical idea of shalom in Hebrew, right? Shalom is not just peace, like absence of conflict, but all of the shalom is having all of the conditions in place that are required for human flourishing. I would just say to Mr. Sammons, how is there human flourishing in the occupied territories of Ukraine, where Russia sets up rape houses, systematically bullies and intimidates teachers who might want to teach in Ukrainian or teach Ukrainian history, takes children, like you said, recruits the young boys to form militias to fight their own countrymen in Ukraine. Where's the shalom for those 10 million people in eastern Ukraine who's had their homes taken away from them and destroyed? Just as a visual too, imagine 20%, for Americans, what if 20% of the continental United States was occupied by Mexico? And all of the people, all of our family and friends that live in those areas are all displaced, their homes destroyed, all of the suffering. And is there shalom by just stopping the violence? I mean, you and I, we both want peace. We want the war to end, but the war has to end justly, like you said. And just stopping the violence isn't going to do that, because as soon as Trump is gone and there's a weaker president, Russia's going to come back. If they're not defeated.
I want to close by asking everyone to pray for our Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant brethren in the occupied territories. People have no idea what the Baptists, the evangelicals in these occupied territories are going through. You can look up Mark Sergeyev. He's from Melitopol. I've met him, spent a good amount of time with him when I was in Ukraine, and what he's endured, his family has endured. You can look up the plight of some of the Ukrainian Orthodox priests, of what they've endured in the Russian Orthodox controlled zones. None of their churches exist. There are no Catholic churches in the Russian occupied zone. Why is that? And people just gloss that over. There are no Ukrainian Orthodox churches in those zones. There are no free evangelical churches. There are no Catholic churches. There are no Catholic priests there. Why is that? And don't gloss that over. Why is that?
What happened to our church, our eparchy in Donetsk?
It doesn't exist anymore.
Where are those churches?
So when there's a lot to discuss there, but I want you to pray for those people and not forget them. So, my friends, this is the third anniversary of the
war of aggression,
full-fledged invasion and war of aggression. No one knows how many have died. Maybe 1 million. We don't know how many are maimed, how many are damaged psychologically from this war. The spiritual wounds that will last for decades and decades, to say nothing of the land, the buildings, the agricultural, cultural, educational treasures that have been lost. It's really unfathomable. So we ask that you would pray for these people, our brothers and sisters, and if you know of, is there a good Ukrainian cause that they can donate to? Razom.
Razom is good.
RAZOM
and
for Ukraine.
You know, there's through there you'll find a lot of sources. There's a lot of sites there. So
okay, thank you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.